Uh, is this normal wake up time for you, Steve?
Not far off. Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, we're so grateful for you squeezing us in at 6 o'clock at the start of your day. So people won't know, probably, I'm sure, the viewers. I didn't even realize until I saw the name come in. I thought that name looks familiar, and I had to Google it because I was like, it can't be the Steve that I'm thinking of. And then sure enough, your face pops up. So you've I just spent a bit of time at midnight when all our other guests had kind of gone to bed, telling Paul a bit about my story and sort of the years growing up in Pakistan. And you've sort of been witness to that journey, haven't you? You've supported our family since when? When did all that start? I can't even remember.
I remember visiting your mum and dad. Well, it started in the early 80s, I think. And I remember visiting your mum and dad in Salt Lea just before you were going to travel to Pakistan as a family in probably early 90s. I remember your dad when he was the staff worker at BCM.
Yeah.
An urban farm. Yeah, quite something.
Yeah, and you've seen our family through all sorts. And I was just telling Paul about the Pakistan days, about kind of coming back and some of the massive challenges involved over that season. And you saw it all, heard it all firsthand.
Yeah, it was quite something. Yeah. But it was pretty much a life-changing experience going to Pakistan. It was immensely valuable, and so grateful for that opportunity, really. So we were so blessed, and even today, I meet people in my work, and we just get talking about, I've been to Pakistan, and it's a fantastic joining point. It's really good.
Yeah. And how long were you there for?
Just a week. Can you believe it? It was just a week.
Just a week.
Yeah, but it was definitely like a pinpoint in our life.
And when what year was that?
1999.
1999. Okay. I mean, I should remember that, but I was telling Paul that kind of I think because international lifestyle, change is so absolute that I've noticed myself that kind of there's very much a sense of a chapter closing, and then I kind of, once I've written it, I put it aside. And so my memory over certain periods, like Pakistan days, I obviously I can remember, but it's more like recalling a storyline of a book that I've read, as opposed to kind of like, part of my own experience. So yeah, I apologize that I don't remember your visit. So tell us. We've got people waking up and joining us. Good morning, Liz. We've been really blessed with having a faithful audience. We've been going for 20 hours now. 4 to go.
Well, you must be exhausted.
I am. I had a cheeky half an hour nap while Paul was praying. I was like, Paul, you've got this. You pray for mental health. I'm just going to go put my head down for 2 seconds, just because I did notice that I was really struggling to string sentences together. And I thought, I've got morning guests coming up. I need to give them my best. So half an hour's sleep and a shower, and we're back on it. But I think the whole campaign that we're running at the moment is about men's mental health. And it's about just wanting, there's a couple of reasons we're doing it. The main one really is just to make sure that we're adding to the conversation around it. I'm sure you'll be aware of the statistics. So things like 4 in 10 men have never opened up about their mental health. Top reasons being they feel too ashamed, they don't want to be a burden. And then it's not to be too dramatic about it, but those stats are killing us. Highest cause of death for those under the age of 50, suicide. So we just want to really tackle the subjects, and we've chatted to lots of people with a church background, so pastors, people leading churches, and just try to kind of bottom out what are some of the issues that churches are facing. And we the guy just before you that caught the end of, Dave Quack, he's a pastor in Australia, and he was saying same over there, that just actually the church is really lagging behind in terms of their understanding of things like this. And he was diagnosed with bipolar, and that's been a real journey for him and his church to kind of go on that and figure that out together. So we would love we would love just your take and thoughts as someone that I'm guessing you've got several hats that you could put on to relate to this. So you're a consultant in neurology and
neurorehabilitation.
Yeah. So question number one is, please tell me what that means. You're also an associate at Christian Medical Fellowship. So I would love to, I'd love to hear a bit about that and kind of, and am I right in thinking that your role within that is very much focused around pastoral care?
Yeah.
And is that for other Christian medical professionals?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So you've got that hat on, and I'm sure there's loads you can speak into there. And then you're quite actively involved in church life, aren't you?
Yeah.
So start with whichever hat you want. Actually, no. Before we go there, I would love to know. Take those three hats. This has obviously been something that's really been a significant part of your life. Why? Where did that all start? What was your origin story as to why this is something that's of particular interest?
Yeah. Do you want me to start now?
Yeah, start there. Start with the origin story.
Excellent. Okay. So I think the experience of mental ill health is so alien that it's incredibly difficult to comprehend. And I remember being about age 12 at secondary school, and 11 or 12, and my world changed. It was extremely disturbing. All I knew was I was standing outside the classroom waiting to go in and crying, and my sister came up. She says, "What's the matter?" I said, I don't know. And I remember being extremely disturbed, anxious, obsessive, not treading on the footpaths, rituals. And for the whole of that spring term, the world was changed. It was as if there was both a sense of a realization how big the world was and how small I was. I was growing up into it. And there was a crisis of anxiety, fear, and it was characterized by obsessions, trying to do things to prevent bad things happening. So a lot of anxiety and obsessive things. And it led to quite bizarre behaviors with, writing long essays and thinking I'd got to do loads of homework. And really for an 11, 12-year-old, it was very unusual behavior. And I was greatly helped by one or two people. There was a fantastic maths teacher who got alongside and helped. But that was later on, really. But for that first year, it was a devastating thing. And it still is with me. And I got... It was never formally diagnosed, and if I look back now, I'd say that was probably just an adolescent bit of anxiety and depression, or a bit of obsessive compulsive experience. But what it did was it made me incredibly aware of what it feels like when your mental framework is dislocated, and things don't feel the same anymore, and the world is an alien place, and that response of fearful crying and being it was just overwhelming, and obviously very alien to my peers who didn't understand at all what was going on in the rough and tumble of adolescence. But I'm deeply grateful for that experience, because I still remember that it took probably 3 to 4 years for those feelings to resolve, and I had the experience of always looking back over my shoulder. It was coming back again. And the echoes. And in fact, it probably didn't fully resolve until I became a Christian, until I had an experience of faith. That I think was a turning point when eventually I stopped being governed by fear and OCD, and my life changed. So deeply grateful for that, because as the years have gone by, I've recognized the same thing in others. And if you haven't had that experience, you can't perhaps relate to what someone's going through when their mental health deteriorates or crumbles, because it is so alien. We're used to things being normal. So that's I think probably that was the index event, I think.
Do you mind me asking how your parents responded to that, and kind of, because that must have been confusing for them as well, to not really understand what was going on?
Well, my mum gave me vitamin pills and a tonic and a bit of a pep talk, and they were perplexed. And maybe that is an interesting part of it, because the family, you're not ill, as it were, from a mental health point of view in isolation. There's usually other things around you that have triggered the events. It is an illness. Let's be very clear that it's not just behavioural, and that's I think the thing that's shocking. That's the thing that I remember, that it wasn't just behaviour. It wasn't just I decided something or I had agency in this. It had taken over my life. And you're right, my parents were just perplexed and puzzled. And you might say, well, were they part of the problem? Probably were, but I'm not going to talk for them today.
Yeah. Do you know if there was much family history of it? Was it kind of quite a new thing?
No, that's a really good point. And I think that's something I've seen over the years, that you don't experience mental illness in isolation. There is usually a story in the background. So interestingly, my grandmother had a lot of anxiety, and in fact my mum had anxiety in later life. She never had OCD, not a bit of it, but looking back, there was probably a kind of genetic predisposition to anxiety, and a little bit of obsessionality. My grandma definitely had OCD. I remember visiting her, and many times as a youngster, and she'd get me doing some cleaning for her. And I remember thinking it's extremely odd that I had to move the fridge to within 1 or 2 millimeters of a set position. And so I said, she's balmy, But in fact, looking back, that was almost certainly an OCD thing, and probably an anxiety thing too. So I can see those traits, and I think that's the story we hear, isn't it? We learn our behaviours from our peers, our families, but there's always a genetic kind of twist in it as well. That means that there's certain bits of the jigsaw that are laid out before you walk.
Yeah. And then tell us about that faith moment, because that sounds significant. What happened there?
Well, I was born. The other slightly complicating factor is that I was in a form of Christianity that I would think you would describe as cultic. There's a lot of branches of Christianity where people become a sort of fortress mentality, and we're the only ones that are right, and the whole world's So I was very much in that sort of camp. But also I was in a situation.
Was that because your parents were as well? So that's the environment you grew up in.
Yeah. And it was extremely legally framed. So everything we did was about really obedience to law. And which I think was probably why I was so inclined to being a bit obsessive about things. And I was extremely fearful, because really there was no certainty. I knew that I wasn't up to it, and I also knew as I was growing up, and the range of things you can get into just broadens, that I was getting into more and more, shall we say, adverse, bad stuff, and I just couldn't beat it. And so I began to feel very much afraid, really. And oddly enough, in the kind of faith group we were in, there was a belief that you didn't go to hell. The belief was that you were just annihilated, you just went to sleep. But I had an experience in a dream that made me think again, well, what if God really is going to judge us? What if we are going to have to appear before God and give an account, and he is going to judge us? And the penny dropped that I was in big trouble, really, that if God really is who he says he is, and he has the right to judge all people, then that includes me. And I was particularly struck by the verse where Jesus says to people, he come to and say, well, we've done great things, God, we've been really good. And he says, depart from me, I never knew you. And I thought, and somebody challenged me and said, do you know Christ? And it was a silly question in one thing, because how do you know Christ? But actually it really hit the spot for me. And so I was on a quest then to find out, how do I know Christ? The long and the short of it is that I was then looking to see how could I experience a relationship with God. So I ended up going to a church where somebody just simply explained the gospel, that Jesus died for our sins, and therefore God will accept us because of what Jesus has done. He'll pay the price, and we can be not just accepted, but his children. And that was absolutely fantastically changing. So I was very fearful, as I said, but after I started to walk with God as my father, and so I didn't have to be afraid anymore and prove, and I was loved, I started to think a bit more widely. So actually thought, well, maybe I should try and do medicine. I hadn't done science at school because I was afraid that I was a duffer and I would fail and I couldn't do it. And I went to the physics teacher, and God bless this man. After I'd finished GCSEs, I said, I want to do medicine, but I've only done one O level. Will you help me do physics? And physics was like so difficult. And he said, yeah. So I just, for 6 weeks, I went to the lab, and I had the audacity to go to the A-level tutor and say, I want to do A-level physics. And the guy said, you haven't done the O-level? I said, well, I've done this. And they said, okay. So I did it. And the point was, it was like fear was no longer part of it. If God loves you, you can try and you can do it, and he'll help you, and he'll be with you. So I just had to go. Anyway, the long and short of it is that I got physics O level without too much trouble at a good grade, and went on and got my A levels and went on to medical school. But and all along, the fear thing was transformed. And even today, I still, obviously, we all walk with our fears, but the relationship with God by faith through Christ means that the fear doesn't have to be the determinant, because someone has said that they love us unconditionally, and that's God. So that was my kind of walk into it.
I mean, what an amazing truth to grab hold of at such a young age, because I still can be covered by fear, that kind of that where you haven't completely grasped the sense that actually no matter what, God loves you, and you know, it to have really grasped that at a point, you know, to the point where it was impacting your decision making at such a young age is incredible. When you started medicine, did you know straight away that you'd particularly go into the field that you've ended up in?
Great question. No. And that's interesting too, because that relationship with God through Christ is, as Christians, I think we believe that we would always make that the first thing. So oddly enough, I had a light bulb moment one winter weekend when I was a junior doctor on call, and I saw the surgical registrar take somebody to theatre, and it was a big mistake, and I thought, oh my goodness, I could never do this. And I also had a light bulb moment when my surgical boss early one morning strode into theatre just as the patient who'd been bleeding all night died actually on the table, and the guy walked in and he saved the person's life. And I thought, I couldn't act that quick. I think I need to have a bit more data. So I knew I was going to go and do medicine rather than surgery, so be a physician. And then I just made my decision to stick around with the church actually we were in, and just follow whatever came up. And I got to a point, so I need a specialty, so I prayed, and then eventually a door opened for me to do neurology. And I'm very grateful to my mentors and people who encouraged me there. And then I thought at the end of the training I'd have to leave you know, where we live, and leave the church and get a proper job somewhere else, you know, definitive job. And the guy said, well, would you consider applying for neuro rehab? And I said, well, okay, yeah. So I then was duly accredited. So I did neurology with neuro rehab, and I stayed put. When I got there, I thought, it's brilliant. Why didn't anybody tell me about this? So
what is neuro rehab? Because it's not a phrase I think I've heard of before.
Okay, so essentially it's the branch of medicine that seeks to enable and support people who come through neurological illnesses, or that are born with neurological illnesses or trauma that leads to neurological damage, so damage to the brain, spine, muscles. Yeah. You're trying to enable independence, but also improve quality of life. So a lot of people misconceive it and think, oh, it's about getting me back to normal. And that is absolutely the first thing that someone says when you meet them. But eventually there's a journey from this kind of restoration, I'm going to get back to normal, to transformation. This is the new normal. I'm going to deal with this and you know, live my life to the full. So I'm the kind of medical bit of that journey, and there's many other people in the team, the occupational therapists, the physiotherapists, the psychologists. Everybody does their bit. The medical bit is really to make sure, have we got the diagnosis right? What is the prognosis? How's this going to go? What's the trajectory? What's my bit? And then what medical things like medicines or interventions, injections can I contribute? And also it's a lot of imagination as well. You've got to think, what about this person's life? How can it work? So it's enablement essentially for people who've got neurological disability.
So we had Rob Waller on, who obviously you know well. You know of, or I don't know how well you personally know him, yeah, because that's how you originally found about this. And he was explaining his journey a little bit with psychiatry, and how he particularly chose it because he could see that it was a field that was going to drastically change over his lifetime, and that really excited him. The field of neurology must have changed a huge amount since you started, and is going to continue to change. Is that the case? And kind of how has it changed? And kind of compare when you started to where it is now, and the practices and how that's evolved.
That's a really pertinent question, really, to our whole discussion today. So, neurology 40 years ago was a very, should we say, organic specialty. It was full of people who had described phenomena and diseases, and it's very much a visual, physical specialty, because you're looking at the way people are acting, moving, speaking, seeing. And it was very much on a physical, organic basis, and it was divorced from psychiatry, which is, of course, much more behavioural and cognitive, and, if you like, psychoactive. But over the last 40 years, this has been one of the big changes, that the integration of neurology and psychiatry is becoming absolutely undeniable. And for me, one of the biggest things has been not only all the amazing, and they are amazing, scientific advances. I mean, the understanding of the genetic and biochemical basis of diseases has revolutionized. It's just absolutely incredible. But one of the offshoots of that is many things that we thought were psychological are in fact part of a physical disease. And that's a really knotty question. Why is it that you get an enzyme wrong in your brain and it makes you into a criminal? And I'm personally very interested in that whole area of the organic disease affecting the behaviors and mental health side of things. And there's lots of diseases where the two things are just completely part of the same story.
It's been a theme that's come up a little bit, is the relationship between the physical manifestation of ill health. So we had an osteopath, was one of our guests, who did a live session on Paul, massaged his shoulder cuff while also talking about his journey. And he was just sort of talking about the relationship between mental health and that. So I've been looking forward to having you come on to speak into that just a little bit more, just to help us understand the relationship between the physical, the mental, the neurological. There we go. 20 hours in. Not giving me an easy word to say. It's 6 o'clock in the morning. Help us understand that a bit more, kind of for people that aren't familiar, and also as well as the science behind it. I'd love you to then drift into how that relates to stigma and lack of understanding, because I assume that kind of, there's people carrying physical ailments not understanding the neurology behind it, and vice versa. Yeah.
So I think the first thing to say is it's not binary, it's not either or. And it's not the case that every mental health issue is the result of an organic physical disease. But there's some glaring examples, and just at one end of the spectrum. So Huntington's chorea is a disorder where we know there's a gene that produces an abnormal protein in the brain that produces very physical manifestations with an abnormal movement disorder, where you get a jumpy dancing type movement. That's what the word chorea means in Greek. And there's a progressive problem with cognition, and sadly it results in a foreshortening of life. And it's hereditary, and it appears as you move into your your third, fourth decades. There are sometimes people who get it a little earlier. But one of the things that's fascinating is that in the prodrome, the run-up to the manifestation of the disease, there's often sociopathic behaviours. And someone I know was deeply impacted by this, quite close to me, where their best friend, their mother's best friend, became very unusual and started an affair with the husband of with their husband, and this lady went from being a favoured, trusted prayer partner to being the respondent to an adulterous relationship with the husband, and everybody was absolutely bamboozled. And it was only subsequently that it appeared that the movement started and the family history came out, and this sociopathic behaviour. And that was in a church, so that caused mayhem. Nobody got it at the time, and of course the church said, "Well, this is an adulterous affair," and they had church discipline and all the rest of it. And sadly, this person who had Huntington's career carried on with the new partner, and then sadly committed suicide some years later. And that story is deeply impactful because it's quite close to home. And the question there was it the gene or was it just bad behavior? Well, it's undeniable that the gene is in there, and we know this happens, and there are examples of people committing criminal acts. So it doesn't mean that everybody with Huntington's disease is going to behave that way, but it just is an example where behaviors change because of an organic thing. People with systemic lupus, it's well known that they get a neuropsychiatric disorder, and they can become very unwell mentally. And there's a new group of diseases, the autoimmune encephalitis, where the body's own defenses turn against the brain. And one of the manifestations early on of that is, in fact, severe mental health problems, so psychosis. So there's a huge paradigm, if you like, now of brain diseases manifesting with neuropsychiatric presentations. And one of the key things that we have to do, I think, in medicine is when someone comes with mental health symptoms, ask some questions and think. So there's a lovely example we had in church many years ago of a poor lady who rang up. She was a dear soul, and she rang up once and said, "I've lost my faith. I've lost my faith. Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" And she was always a bit nervous, but she was like, she'd just literally fallen off the cliff. So we went round, and he answered the door, and she was as white as a sheet. And I said to her, "I think you're a bit anemic, darling. I think you're probably running out of red juice." "Oh, no, I don't want to go to the hospital. I've lost my faith." So we prayed with her and we said, "Thank you, Lord." And the next morning she did go to the GP, and her hemoglobin was 4. So normal is anything above 11. And she needed several bags of blood. And within about 3 bags of blood, her faith was just restored and she was back to a bit normal. And it was a great example of his faith crisis had got a very organic basis. So that's some of the story, but there's more to follow.
It's really interesting because we've had one of the themes that's been coming out is talking about the fact that we are mind, body, and spirit, and actually we talk about mental health, we talk about physical health, but the health of our spirit isn't often talked about. But this is adding a whole new dimension to that, when actually they can be potentially so completely interlinked. I think we're in the middle of talking about the development of understanding. I guess with a lot of these mental health issues and a lot of knowledge around trauma and what's going on in the brain and neurology, the question is, how do we take that knowledge and how do we use it within church environments and within, as Christians, to create more accepting and safe environments, to be more understanding, and to help people feel safe, whatever their authentic self is, even if that means struggling with neurological issues. So a big question. But how do we take that knowledge and start applying it to church context, applying it to cultural context?
Well, I think an event like this is an extremely important contribution to the debate, really. I think there has been a greater move to look at mental health within churches, but I do think that it's got a long way to go. I think there's many aspects to this. There's, of course, neurodiversity, And we've encountered over the years many pastoral issues that are actually just a reflection of neurodiversity. So somebody who gets on a line in church and won't let something go and seems to be causing a problem. And then if you look carefully, it's because they've got some neurodiverse characteristics and that they perhaps lack social cognition, or their social reciprocity is impaired, and everybody interprets it as either bad behavior or they're just difficult and they avoid them. Whereas we should embrace people as bearing the image of God, made in God's image, and whatever the, as it were, difficulties our particular version of God's image presents, we are told, I think, to love one another at all costs, and just as Christ loved us. So but recognizing that the person might be abrasive, not because they're in deep sin or they don't read their Bible or they're just a nasty piece of work, but realizing that that is the way they're wired is extremely helpful. Also, understanding, pastorally, that you have to deal with people as individuals as God made them. So, if someone does have a problem with high levels of anxiety and struggles to exercise faith, then supporting them in that, and actually seeing that there's probably huge value in their difference. So someone encountered once had terrible anxiety and asked for prayer every week to overcome this fear and this depression, and wanted to know if they'd ever feel normal again, and inconsolable really. But that same person had huge empathy for others, and all the way through COVID, faithfully contacted people, just lovingly. And so there's horses for. So seeing that we are made in God's image, and that they are each one of us, because of that, has something to contribute.
Through, you are actively involved in church, so I would love to know what are some of the things that we can be doing as churches to be more understanding. And what if there's a church pastor listening that goes, yep, Steve, I completely hear that, and I recognize that kind of I need to be more aware of what's actually behind some of the demonstrating behaviors. Any top tips, pointers, first steps, little things that can actually make a really big difference in communities?
So I think recognition is really important. So, that awkward situation might well have mental health triggers in the background, and that takes a lot of the stress out of it when you realize, as I said, you're not dealing just with someone who is making choices to do things. Dealing gently with people, and I think that's so important. We're told to show perfect gentleness, absolute humility, and having compassion, and understanding that each individual is to be loved, as I said, as someone who reflects the image of God. That's important because it usually takes the fire and the combat role out of the situations. And then it directs prayer. And we've got nothing actually in church apart from prayer. But let's not think there's some clever techniques we can do. Prayer and the word of God and the sacraments are all we've got in pastoral care. And if we can pray faithfully, we will see God work. And I think that's what. And the other thing, perhaps there is one more thing we've got, is recognizing when your limits have been reached. So, for example, I knew a church where there was someone who'd got terrible problems with clutter, with hoarding, and that was actually a very deep-seated thing that goes back to a childhood bereavement. There's a psychotherapeutic hypothesis there. In other words, something's happened and that person's reacting in this way. We can't prove that. But what's clear is that is a very complicated and difficult situation. And in that particular situation, then seeking outside help was vitally important. And I would say that seeking outside help is really important, and also getting the data. So just quickly touching on another pastoral kind of interaction. So sometimes people have dissociative non-epileptic attacks. In other words, their mind goes somewhere and their body goes somewhere, and they have what looks like an epileptic seizure. And this is actually a very common phenomenon. It's the most common cause of admission to intensive care with epilepsy, because people don't differentiate between the two in the crisis. And it's actually quite common for these kind of attacks to occur in churches, because you're at an emotionally, as it were, safe place, And very often things come up through the preaching or through the music, and then this may trigger a dissociative non-epileptic attack. And there are all many complex things that can cause a non-epileptic attack disorder. But the first thing is it needs to be dealt with compassionately. And many people with NEAD, non-epileptic attack disorder, tell me the ambulanceman came and told me to stop faking it, because you do have awareness that sometimes during a non-epileptic attack, a dissociative attack. But in some cases in churches, there can be a huge amount of disruption. And in my career, at least twice, either a priest or a church minister has come with the patient to the clinic and says, what should we do? We can't run church anymore. This person has a seizure every time we have a service. Now, what they needed was a deep understanding of the nature of the problem, and then they needed to partner with the person's medical attendants. Now, that may not be possible without the person's consent. If they don't want you to get involved, they don't. But just to be aware that seeking information with the person's consent, working with them and with the professionals could be very helpful. And a lot of pastors, I think, don't even go there. They don't get involved. But or the pastoral team should be working to support the individual in that kind of situation. And likewise with other mental health problems, not backing off, but not being nosy either, not being pushy, but just being available to help. And that can be really, really helpful and it sets the tone in the church. And I think the other thing is honesty, being straight and saying, look, we all get mental health issues. So just a few tips, I think.
That's absolutely fascinating. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that. You kind of that comment there that I can't remember the exact term, but the non-epileptic
attack disorder. Yeah.
The fact that actually could be brought on by the church environment, and that kind of combination of highly emotive but kind of safe at the same time. It makes me wonder kind of what are some of the other things that are impacted by that, because I get that, like in a church environment it's a sensory experience that you don't actually have pretty much anywhere else, in terms of the kind of collective singing, the kind of the highly visionary emotive talks that are kind of asking for and intentionally designed to create an emotive response. So what are some of the other, I don't want to use the word conditions, what are some of the other ways in which people can react that is actually caused by the church environment? It's something I've never thought about before, so I don't know if there's much to say on that.
I don't think there's a lot to say on that, because everyone's an individual. So, and it isn't just church. I mean, you're right, church is highly emotive in many ways. I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that God is present in his word, God is present in his people. And when you are together, I think there is a spiritual dimension which the Bible speaks about. And I think that's probably why things come up. And again, just on a point that if someone does start to feel exhibit mental distress in church, then it's important that there's privacy and there's not exhibitionism and chaos. You just want compassion. You just want someone to be there and not make a spectacle of things. So that's just one tip, I think. Just coming back to the whole question of not just church, but shall we say situations that could trigger these kind of symptoms. It's as if the body speaks when the mind and the words don't work. So I can think of people who get panic attacks who cannot explain why this occurs, but it just comes out. But it's symptomatic of a lot of things going on inside. And I think this is relevant to men's health, and since this is our focus today, that when you don't necessarily, when you can't articulate it, the body will speak. So the way I see it is that if you are exposed to trauma, that is a situation where you lack any form of control and things happen to you that are adverse, then we all react to that in different ways, obviously. But that leaves a big a big scar, a big hole really where the damage has been done, and it may be impossible to articulate what they did to you, and as a result things come out physically. So there are people who have been victims of torture who completely lose the power of speech, and they can write, they can read, they can function, they cannot speak. And this occurs as a result of a traumatic or deeply traumatic experience that's occurred. So some of our refugees are suffering this kind of dissociation. It's possible you can paralysis. There's people who have, for example, a miscarriage, and okay, that's not men's mental health, but a deep sense of loss, and they lose the power to walk. And you say, well, what's wrong with you? Pull yourself together. But actually it's an expression of deep distress. And that's one part of it. There are many other reasons why. Very interestingly, those kind of physical manifestations are often, in our experience, they're triggered by some physical problem. So, a person who has perhaps been born with a weakness of a leg in cerebral palsy may find that their cerebral palsy gets worse. So those physical triggers, those physical traits are then amplified by the mental distress. It's a complicated area, but it's one of the reasons why, a man might suddenly start to get panic attacks. I think, what's this about? I'm a proper guy. And it's actually the body speaking. That's a warning. Then come on, take stock. What is going on here? Why is this happening? And of course, it's very much more respectful to present with a physical symptom, but is that what is actually going on in the mind? It's not. In my experience, people do not consciously. It's not conscious, and these physical symptoms emerge, and it's just mystifying.
And I mean, how do we begin to and you can answer this with your multiple hats on, or whichever one you choose. How do we begin to create environments that are safer, that allow men that space to talk before it gets to the point where the body has to speak, but also when the body starts to speak, have people around that can recognize that and understand that?
Okay. I think first thing is, don't fix it.
Yeah,
it's a big mistake. Is that you approach the whole thing with a fix it mentality. That's the last thing you need to do. In fact, most usually, in my experience, you can't fix it, and you shouldn't try, because it runs the risk of trivializing and minimizing the person's experience. And you come in with three key scriptures. I'm just going to pray for you now, and then it's all going to be fine, isn't it? That is so facile. It's not going to work. So the first thing is to listen well. Absolutely listen well, and ask the questions, just like you're probing with me today, which is great. Ask the questions, listen well, and keep listening in every department, body, mind, and spirit, and don't try and fix it. I think if you want to do anything at some point in a Christian context, ask the person, if there's a particular scripture that God's speaking to, what is God saying to them? And let them explain their spiritual experience, where they're, because often in doing that, the penny will drop. Rather like, when I started this story, I was full of fear and I couldn't do anything, and I didn't know how to do so. And then God comes along and says, I'm with you, it's okay. And just realize, helping the person to get to that point where they say, yeah, God's with me. This could be different, but not trying to fix it. So definitely those are key things, listening well, and then just having some scriptures in the back of your mind, but let the person speak. That is definitely the way forward. And if they're the strong silent type who doesn't want to speak, well, accept that. Just say, okay, I hear what you're saying, and my ears are open. But just letting the person prompt the ability to explore, and praying like mad, because ultimately it's God who's going to help that person see. That's what we believe as in our Christian faith, that God will speak to a person, and he's more interested in their well-being than we will ever be. So just pray that God will do what he is willed to do.
Mm.
So anything you wanted to add, Paul? After 20 hours, I've started to recognise when Paul wants to say something. Because it makes a very particular.
No, it's just very, it's very, very interesting. I guess what I'm interested in, would like your opinion on, is where do we get involved within churches and organisations? Where is there a responsibility pastorally to be involved? And also, where do we have a responsibility to not get involved beyond the actual, hey, look, we're supporting you, maybe to signpost?
Yeah.
And what do we do?
Okay, I think that's a great question. Thank you. So the first thing, as we've talked about, is awareness and spotting when someone's not right. There's good evidence from the military, actually, in the platoons, that a simple mental health first aid training for basic squaddies is way more effective than increasing the numbers of psychologists or people, because the guys who are walking alongside each other spot when there's a problem, and they see the red flags, and you probably know all about that. So awareness and readiness to spot the red flags. Number two, I think risk assessment. So Zero Suicide Alliance has got some great training materials, and in the pastoral teams I'm working with, we try and suggest that people look at those materials, and they're very simple: see, say, sign. So you see something and you ask it. You say, are you thinking of doing something to yourself? Have you thought of suicide or whatever? And that is a lifesaver for sure. I mean, I've actually seen that happen, that it's saved people's lives. So training, risk assessment, realizing that it's only a tiny little step, isn't it, between feeling a bit down and a bit end of the road and nothing's going to go right, and doing something that's irreversible. And I've actually seen people who've come the other side of that, people who've jumped off motorway bridges or lain on railway tracks, who've survived, and they've said to me, I'm so sorry, and wept, because that they realized that wasn't the way. And when you've seen that, it gives you a very high level of conviction that prevention really is important, and asking people. And there's a deep compassion that you feel when you see that. You think, I don't ever want to see that for someone. So risk assessment is vital. Thirdly, this whole thing of, is there a physical issue? Are you anemic? Are you hypothyroid? Is there something organic going on? So, is there something that, get a checkup? So, we had an issue once, and the first thing I said to the guy was, I said, go get checked up. And yes, there was something that needed treating. In fact, the behaviours were all to do with, a recognisable problem. So see, get alongside, and just come back there. Don't try and that's the danger of trying to fix it. You're having a spiritual thing, I can pray for you and everything, but that's just so facile. So listen well, risk assess, ask if there's a physical cause, look for it, get a checkup, and then I think the third thing is get the right environment. So much of what we do in churches is very sort of family and whatever, and blokes don't quite relate to that. So look at the structures we've got in place in church. Have we got places where men feel safe, active, can do their stuff? I mean, this is common ground for all of us, I guess, in our churches. So there's a few thoughts.
Well, that's really helpful.
Those are really great thoughts. Steve, we've got about 5-10 minutes left. I wouldn't want to leave without hearing about your role as pastoral care for Christian Medical Fellowship. That sounds fascinating. First, tell us a bit about what Christian Medical Fellowship is, and then what being a pastor and providing pastoral care to them, what that requires and what's entailed in that.
So Christian Medical Fellowship was founded 75 years ago this year, and lives to support Christian healthcare workers to live and speak for Jesus Christ. And that involves both policy and ethics, helping Christians navigate the challenges of the healthcare world. It involves outreach in terms of supporting medical work across the world, but critically it involves supporting healthcare workers in their everyday role. So we there's been a big emphasis on this in CMF over the last few years, and I've been part of that story to develop pastoral care for doctors and nurses in particular. And when we started, we did a bit of a survey, and we realised that there was what called a church clinical gap. And this isn't to annoy pastors who are watching, but the people who are actually healthcare workers said, well, about 56% of them said, my church doesn't get it. And, you know, either there's patients in the congregation or there's colleagues in the congregation, or you just don't get it. And just to give you an example, I remember walking into church one day and I just told somebody, that a 16-year-old boy and his mum, that the dad was not going to make it. And it was a horrible situation. And as you say, the emotive situation of church and the sense of being in a loving, safe place. And I just said to this friend, you know, it's been a bit of a difficult week, and yeah, and I just started crying, and I was really quite, and the look on this person's face, who I knew very well, was fear actually and horror. She didn't know what to do, because this guy who normally is together, like a, you know, crying his eyes out. And I kind of mopped my tears and wended off. So there is this church clinical gap. People find it difficult, and that's not a criticism. How can you know, get it? And then there was obviously a huge amount of work stress, and that's the big thing for medics in the UK, is the work stress and the workload. What are the things that came out? So we've recognise certain people who've come volunteered as pastoral partners and try to train them and get them organised. And interestingly, looking back now, 5-6 years into this, there's two big streams. There's still lots of people coming with work stress and wanting to, well, not lots, I'll come on to that. The issues are work stress, but also flourishing. And that's an important part of pastoral care. And I think it's a message to get across. It's not problem focused, it's growth focused. And I would say that when we talk about men's mental health, when we talk about the whole thing, the emphasis is actually about growth, about flourishing, as much as trying to deal with problems. And that's partly one of the ways into men's mental health, I think, is how we frame it. And if we frame it as, you've got a problem, you need fixing, well, of course I don't want to do it. But if you frame it as, which I think is what God says, I've got a future for you, I've got a plan for you, I want you to grow, then that is a very different story. So what we fortunately find is that a lot of the people who we're engaging with are interested in flourishing as much as just dealing with problems. But the other thing is the puzzle of engagement. People don't come to anonymous and, you know, helplines, inboxes, or anything else. They come when they've got relationships. So vital really to pastoral care in our setting is the building of relationships. And I think that's the same in church. You can give sermons, you can recommend books, you know, which are value laden, or you can have groups, but ultimately it comes down to the relationship and the person saying, I can trust this person, we can talk. So the big story then is, yes, there is a need for support, and there's a need certainly to help people cope with incredible workplace stresses, but there's also, interesting, the thing people want to come about is about flourishing.
That's great.
Steve, thank you so much for your time today. Paul, is there any sort of passing words you?
No, but again, this sense of community is coming up as a theme. It's really emerged across the whole talkathon, that people want to have a sense of belonging, to be heard, to be valued for who they are, not just what they do. And that actually when we create safe environments for that, people will talk. They will. But I think some of the way you framed that today is really, really helpful from a practical perspective, with all the knowledge background that you've got. And I'm wondering, you know, there might be people who are wondering now, you know, what practically can we put in place that will maybe let that message be known. I mean, we're here, we're trying to do that. Yeah, really value your work and your time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah, and that the message of compassion, Steve, you just carry so innately, like you embody it, and I think it's like it's that feels like the solution to all of this, in terms of it's not enough to just have the knowledge, it's not enough to just be caring, but that compassion that comes with understanding the knowledge, but also then knowing how to apply it, is great. So thank you so much for your time. Our next guest is in 5 minutes, and I'm desperate for the toilet.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Steve, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye now.
Talk to you soon, hopefully. Take care.
Well, again, some great insight.
Yeah.